Eating dietary fat, especially in the form of saturated fat, has been demonized for a very long time. And it has been demonized by a multitude of different three-letter agencies that are usually a part of the US government. These agencies include USADA, the FDA, the CDC, all of these agencies, the American Heart Association, so many of them are big promoters of low-fat diets. And there's a bunch of corrupt reasons for why they actually promote these low-fat diets. Mainly it is because they want to promote profit and increase profit for the big food corporations such as Kellogg's, Tyson, all the other ones that manufacture processed foods. But that is for another video. Today we're going to talk about the main reasons why eating fat is good for you, especially eating saturated fat, and why eating a low-fat diet is not good for you. So, of course, if a low-fat diet does work for you, by all means continue to eat a low-fat diet. Just remember that this channel is for resource purposes only. If a low-fat diet does work for you, then great, continue to do it. All I'm doing is presenting you information and presenting you my opinion on why I do not think a low-fat diet works for everybody. So the three big myths that we always hear about saturated fat is that one, is going to raise your LDL, number two, is going to cause atherosclerosis, and number three, it's going to give you a heart attack. So the best way to actually dispel all three of these myths is the whole process of de novo lipogenesis. And this is the generation of fat through glucose. And most people think the generation of fat can actually happen from fat itself. And that's really not the case, because if you have fat come into the body, it's going to be processed in a much different way than glucose will. So when you compare the two macronutrients, fat and carbohydrates together, they are processed much differently by the metabolism. So if we look at this process known as de novo lipogenesis, it is basically the saturation of glucose to create triglycerides and put them into the blood, shuttle them off to the blood in the form of LDL. So most people think that this would be the case for dietary fat. Dietary fat would come into the body and it would just be stored immediately into the blood as blood triglycerides. But that is not the case at all whatsoever. So that is why whenever somebody develops atherosclerosis, they usually blame saturated fat because they think fat makes them fat. And that is another myth that usually is not true. It really is the saturation of carbohydrates in the form of glucose that creates these high triglycerides in the blood. Because when too much carbohydrates come in and it cannot be stored any longer, it gets saturated from this process known as de novo lipogenesis, and fat is generated and shuttled off into the blood through LDL, low density lipoprotein. So this is why we cannot just continue to blame fat, because fat can be turned into a multitude of different substances. One of these is ketones. This is why your blood ketone levels go up whenever you're on a ketogenic diet and you're using fat as fuel and you eliminate carbohydrates. The opposite is not true for glucose. If you have a bunch of excess glucose coming in and low amounts of fat, then you're probably going to have high triglycerides and high blood sugar and all sorts of other things that you do not want to be high. And yes, absolutely, you will have high triglycerides in your blood if you continue to eat high amounts of carbohydrates and low amounts of fat, because at the end of the day, the body can only store so much glucose to the point where it needs to saturate this glucose through the liver and shuttle it off to the blood. And this is why you're going to have high triglycerides if you have an excess of carbohydrates coming into the body and low amounts of fat. Because no matter what, if you have an excess amount and it comes to the liver, it's going to be saturated and it's going to be shuttled off to the blood. So if the process of de novo lipogenesis is not enough to sell you on the idea that saturated fat can actually be good for you, then let's take a look at this study done in the late 60s in Minnesota. This was a 8-year randomized control trial where they got an interventional group and a control group. The interventional group ate high amounts of polyunsaturated fat. They did not eat any saturated fat, or in other words, they actually ate very low amounts of saturated fat. And the control group did the opposite. They ate high amounts of saturated fat. And what they found at the end of this 8-year study is that the interventional group that ate high amounts of polyunsaturated fat had a 22% increase in mortality at the end of the study. One thing to mention, though, is that serum cholesterol did decrease in the interventional group that ate polyunsaturated fat. But in all honesty, this really isn't a very significant finding when you are seeing an increase in mortality in a randomized control trial that controls every single one of the variables. So if your cholesterol goes down, great. But if your mortality is going up, that is much more concerning. People would think 22% isn't that much, but it really is, especially when you're talking about mortality. That's a lot. So, and of course, these people in the polyunsaturated group were eating things like vegetable oils and margarine, and people in the saturated fat group were just eating fatty cuts of meat, eggs, and anything that had high amounts of saturated fat. So, I mean, not only was this study very long in duration, it was 8 years, but it was also a randomized control trial. So this is very difficult to dispute. And the mortality levels were unchanged in the saturated fat group in comparison to the polyunsaturated fat group. So if we can draw any conclusion here, is that we would want to have less linoleic acid from polyunsaturated fat and maybe more saturated fat. And once again, just remember that this is not universal to everybody. There's going to be a small population of people that may not do well with red meat or may not do well with saturated fat. But it is very important to note that there was an increase in mortality in the group of people that were eating polyunsaturated fat. So maybe you're not sold on the previous study just yet. Maybe it's because it was done in the late 60s. Well, I have another study that is also a randomized controlled trial, and it was done a week ago. And it compared a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet to a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. And what they found at the end of the study is that the high-fat group actually had a reduction in their hemoglobin A1c, their non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and they also saw a reduction in their weight. And the opposite seemed to be true for the low-fat group, an increase in their weight, an increase in their hemoglobin A1c, and their increased risk for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. NAFLD, otherwise known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, is the accumulation of fat around the liver in the form of visceral fat. And this usually occurs whenever there's too much subcutaneous fat and the storage starts to run out, so it gets stored in the organs. And this is something you definitely do not want. So the higher your visceral fat level is, you have a higher probability of mortality, essentially. So you always want to have a low visceral fat level no matter what. And your hemoglobin A1c is a biomarker that measures the blood sugar in your body. So you definitely would not want this to be at a high level at all. And they did see this increase in the low fat group, and they saw a decrease in the high fat group. So that is something that you want to be at least at a moderate level. You never want to have an elevated hemoglobin A1c. So there you go. Those are two really interesting studies. One was done a week ago and one was done in the late 60s. Even though that was done in the late 60s, that's still in recent time, and it was done for 8 years. So it's very difficult to dispute these findings, especially because they were randomized control trials. And I will repeat this once again, I am just a resource. So if something is working for you and I'm saying that it doesn't, continue to do it. Continue to do what works for you. All I'm doing is providing this very prominent information to you, and you use a resource how you wish. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you liked it, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.